Hello and welcome to a very chilly Essex University. This is episode 62 of the CRICKETher Vodcast. We've come here to watch Essex against Middlesex in the London Championship. At the moment there's not a lot happening. There's a damp area on one side of the pitch that they're a bit concerned about, so we don't know if we're actually going to get any play or not, but hey, let's record a vodcast, Raf.
The glamorous life of a cricket journalist.
Now, last week we discussed the county T20s, and we said that Kent had effectively won the thing as we saw it. Obviously, as people pointed out on social media, of course, they only won their group, and plenty of other counties also won their group. But I think that we felt that Kent had really shown a degree of dominance in one of the most difficult groups. But they still didn't get to win a trophy, Raf, or did they?
Well, as we saw on Twitter, I think it was the day after we released the vodcast, they have actually got a trophy, and Tash Farrant was pictured holding it aloft. It's a reasonably small but still deeply significant piece of silverware that just says Regional Southeast Group ECB T20 Winners 2021 or something like that. So effectively it's a cup that Kent have bought specifically for the purposes of this year's T20s. It's an interesting one because you do end up thinking, well, what would have happened if they hadn't won the group? At what point in time was the trophy purchased? But I think it's fair enough for them to recognise the efforts of their team, who have had a really good few weeks, as you said. I think it's really interesting in the broader context of thinking about the meanings of county cricket, because I think what it shows is to some extent it's a little bit of Kent putting up a challenge to the ECB, who, as we know, unsuccessfully have tried to abolish women's county cricket recently. And Kent are actually saying, well, it's actually not great of you, ECB, to not provide us with a trophy and to not provide us with an opportunity for a finals day to actually proclaim ourselves as kind of overall winners. And so we're going to do it ourselves. So there's a little bit of a challenge, I think, from Kent to the ECB there. And there's also, in viewing it kind of in the broader context of the future of women's county cricket, which is still something that everyone, I think, is very uncertain about. Kent are definitely laying down a marker there, I think, and saying we still really care about county cricket, women's county cricket. It's really important to us, and we're prepared to invest in it to the extent of going out and buying our own trophy, so that Tash Farrant has something to wave on the last day of the county T20s. So good for them, really, because we support county cricket, and it seems like they are laying down a bit of a marker there for the ECB. So I think that's actually really interesting. Now, there's been some really interesting news coming out of Australia this week. One thing that has been announced is we now have a schedule for the Women's Ashes, which is going to be played at the start of 2022. 2022 is going to be quite a busy year. And it's going to be an interesting one because they've rejigged the schedule once again. And the one test is now going to be at the start. It's then going to be followed by the 3 T20s, and it's then going to conclude with the 3 ODIs. That's quite interesting, isn't it, Sid?
I think it's generally interesting that they feel obviously the formula isn't quite settled yet, and actually it does take a long time for these things necessarily to settle. That if you look at the time span of organised sport, and if you go back to the Victorian era, things took a long time to settle into the way that we now know them, and we assume that they've been that way forever. But it takes time. So they're still tweaking the format. They've tweaked the points on the test previously, taking it from 6 points to 4 points. Now they're putting the test at the beginning again. Of course, it started off at the beginning and then it went into the middle for a bit, and now it's back at the beginning again. And I guess at some point, that we'll all kind of collectively conclude that there is a best way of doing this, but we're still not quite there yet. So I think that while everyone likes the points format and likes the multi-points series, we're still not 100% certain of exactly how we want to play it. What do you make of the implications, Raf?
Yeah, I think it is interesting to revert back to having the test at the beginning. I think to some extent it's probably been driven this time around by purely pragmatic reasons. There's going to be a very short gap between the end of the Women's Ashes and the start of the 50 over World Cup, so it makes sense to play the 50 over games at the end. They effectively then will serve as a warm-up for the World Cup, because there won't really be very much time, especially if the sides did end up having to quarantine on their route into New Zealand. There won't be a whole lot of time for them to actually play warm-ups, proper warm-ups ahead of the World Cup in New Zealand.
Yeah, that's a really important point, actually, that what we're assuming with this whole schedule is that there will be a travel corridor between Australia and New Zealand. I think they have left a very fine gap. It is possible that the players could finish the Ashes and then fly to New Zealand and quarantine in New Zealand, but that really does only leave almost hours to spare before the opening games in New Zealand. So that's going to be a really tough one. But I guess that they're reasonably confident that travel corridor is going to be in existence and that will all be okay. So fingers crossed for that.
Yep.
But what about the format and things, Raf? How do you see? What's your view on the actual format?
Well, of course, it was actually, so you talked about the points changing for the test. So originally it started off with 6 points for the test, and that was actually, believe that was Claire Connor's original suggestion, because you've obviously got 3 ODIs worth 6 points in total for the ODI leg and 3 T20s worth 6 points in total for the T20 leg. So the 6 points for the test was arguably about putting Test cricket on an equal level with ODIs and T20s. Then in 2014 what happened was that England won the Ashes test right at the start at Perth and went into the rest of the series 6-0, and as somebody who was actually there and reporting on that series, it did really feel like a little bit of a foregone conclusion, therefore, that they had the 6-0 lead and that they were going to win the Ashes. So I believe that Cricket Australia then kind of campaigned very strongly for the test to be downgraded to only being worth 4 points. And they also subsequently moved the test to the middle of the series. So previously we've had it so it starts with the ODIs, then the test in the middle, and then the T20s at the end. As you say, they're kind of jigging around with it a bit. And that's quite interesting. I don't personally think it matters too much where you play the test, although others may disagree, because it's more meaningful about how many points the test is worth. I was originally opposed to it being reduced from being worth 6 points to 4 points. There's now people saying we should downgrade it even further and have the test only being worth 2 points because it just puts too much pressure on that match and it makes the sides play defensively. But my original feeling was, well, actually, I believe that Test cricket is just as valuable a format as 50 over and 20 over cricket, and therefore I don't like the fact that we're kind of effectively downgrading. It felt like we're downgrading the Test to only being worth 4 points. So I certainly don't think that I would support it being downgraded to being worth 2. But my view all along has been that we should be playing 2 tests in the Ashes, and they should be worth either 3 or 2 points each. And I think that, to be honest, that was probably originally Claire Connor's original conception, that they would have 2 tests. But obviously we know that Cricket Australia haven't gone for that ever as an option. But that would certainly be my preference if we're thinking about where we might be with the multi-format Women's Ashes in 5 or 6 years' time, that they end up in a situation where you play 2 tests, and what that does is it really takes the pressure off the tests, because obviously only having a one-off test, you then end up with people playing defensively because they're like, oh, this is my only chance to play the whites, to wear the whites in 2 years, and I've got to stay in, and I'm going to face 100 balls and score 5 runs or whatever, and that's not great for the future of women's Test cricket. And I do think to some extent the sides have to have an eye on the future of the format. From my perspective, I would argue that what's a loss in the Women's Ashes series in the scheme of things, when actually what you're looking at is trying to save the future of women's Test cricket by playing a more exciting game and making it more competitive. And again, we're probably going to be accused of being anti-Australian here, but last time around at Taunton, really, Heather Knight threw down the gauntlet for Meg Lanning and said, look, I've declared behind, it's up to you to set us a total for our 4th innings. And Meg Lanning kind of refused to do that, actually, and then came out and her and Matthew Mott to the press at the end of the day said, oh, well, we're not a charity case and England don't deserve to win. Well, I do think that this is an example of where the players to some extent have to be cognizant of the fact that they're playing effectively for the future of women's Test cricket for all generations of women in future. And if they lose one Ashes Test, if they lose one Ashes series, it's a drop in the hat in the scheme of things, in the scheme of potentially hundreds of years of future women's Test cricket. Now, talking of tests, another really exciting bit of news that's come out of Australia this week has been that Australia are going to be playing another test. But not as part of the Women's Ashes. They are going to be playing a test against India in September, I believe, as part of a series that's going to kick off with some ODIs and T20s, and then they're going to play a test at the end of that, and it's going to be a day-night test, and it's going to be the first Australia-India test played since 2006, I believe. So that's really interesting. Why do you think that that's come about, Sid? Because that's quite a new development, isn't it?
Well, it is a new development. It's an extremely positive development from the perspective of the future of Test cricket, I think, because what it demonstrates is that there's a board other than England that's really pushing this. England have been involved in every Test since that India-South Africa one-off that was played in 2014, was it? And then prior to that, it was another sort of 4 or 5 years before anybody apart from England had played a test, and so it had basically been England and Australia and that one-off test between England and India. So it's very significant that Cricket Australia are doing this, I think, it's a really positive move. The one thing I'm a bit less positive about on a sort of personal basis is that it's going to be a day-night test, which means it's going to be played with a pink ball. I have to say that I am not a fan of the pink ball. They've obviously, the cricket authorities have concluded that they want to play these day-night tests, that they're important in order to be able to capture television audience, to be able to capture fans coming through the gate, and that's all well and good. When they introduced the day-night test, they did a lot of research, and they found that the pink ball was, if you like, the least bad option to go with on this. But of course, the real issue there for me was that it was the least bad option once they'd ruled out the one option which actually made sense, which was play it with a white ball, guys. There's a reason why we've been using white balls for day-night matches for the last 40 years, and it's because that's what people can see. So the one experience I've had of watching a day-night test format was England's warm-up prior to the last away Ashes series, and once the ball was more than about 10 overs old, it became scuffed up, and from the boundary I couldn't see it. Now, my eyesight's not perfect, but I'm not that old, and I can't be the only person having this problem. And ultimately this stems from the refusal to contemplate not wearing whites, because what they're saying is, well, we have to wear whites because it's a test, and therefore we can't use a white ball, which is the only ball that makes sense. Therefore we'll use something that's patently inadequate for the paying spectator. And I think that if they're going to proceed with these day-night tests, honestly, what they really need to do is to bite the bullet and accept that, sorry guys, the one bit of the tradition has to go there, and that's going to be the whites, and you're going to have to play in coloured clothing in order to be able to use a white ball that people can actually see. Okay, that's my rant. You've had your rant, I've had mine.
That's going to be very controversial, I think, Sid. I should say that overall we feel really positively about this, don't we? And overall, I think a few vodcasts ago when I was talking about the England-India series and talking about the one-off test, I was a bit sceptical about the BCCI's commitment to women's test cricket, but it does feel like now there's going to be another test involving India, so if the BCCI are now moving towards a position when they support women's test cricket, then that's really kind of very meaningful for the future of the format.
And if this can become the norm, then that's so positive going forwards, and then hopefully we can start to bring in the New Zealands and the South Africas and things as well.
Yeah, and I think that a kind of honourable mention should go to Nick Hockley here as well, who's the acting CEO of Cricket Australia at the moment. I think he actually came out last September when he took over the role and said, I support more women's tests. And he's actually English. I don't know whether that has any significance in the scheme of things, but he's potentially taken some of the support for women's test cricket that there's been in England over to Australia, and is now almost pushing this agenda of more tests, and it's absolutely welcome. I think that we know that the players want to play more tests, so fantastic, and thank you, Nick Hockley. Probably not watching because CEO of Cricket Australia, a busy man. Now, Sid, do we know if this Australia-India series is going to be similar to the Women's Ashes in terms of being played for points?
Yeah, so as far as we know, there are not going to be points available for this. Obviously, that could change at any point. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Do we think that there should be points for these series? I mean, I tweeted about this earlier in the week, and I said that the one drawback of points is that it does. We come back to the thing about the only test, that it gives the test almost too much meaning, and people become really reluctant to risk losing the test, and therefore the test turns into a grinding draw. But what's your perspective on whether they should play this one for points?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you in terms of kind of playing it defensively. I suppose what I'd say is I'd come back to my earlier point about
your earlier point. You did it.
Oh no! Shut up. People are going to start turning off because of your terrible jokes.
I think they already have that.
So I'll come back to something I said earlier in the vodcast about really what you need is for the players' mindsets to change and to actually start thinking, well, it doesn't, to some extent, it doesn't matter if we lose this test, even if it is in the context of a points-based series. The benefit and the real advantage of a points-based series is that it then entrenches the test for future series. It means that the BCCI can't turn around in a couple of years when they're next due to play Australia or next due to play England and say, oh, actually, hang on a minute, that was just a one-off thing that we were just doing because we were a bit bored after COVID or whatever. It actually means that this is what the future bilateral series between these two countries will look like. So that's really positive. So I do take your point about potentially it would give sides more freedom if, say, the Australia-India test isn't being played for points, but it also would strike me as a bit of a missed opportunity when what you really need is for the players' mindsets to change.
Okay.
And finally, this week we're going to bring you a little bit of an update regarding a campaign that we mentioned last week, the Stump Out Sexism campaign, which is all about bringing equal access for women to Lord's Cricket Ground, and in particular in the context of the varsity match. Now, it's actually the men's varsity match is being played, tomorrow, but today on the day that we're releasing the vodcast, so on Sunday. And there's been some really positive news this week that Oxford and Cambridge universities, I believe, have both issued statements or at least have announced that as of 2022 there is going to be gender parity in the varsity matches. So that means that the women's varsity teams will have an opportunity to play on the main ground at Lord's, which is brilliant and is obviously partly what the whole campaign's been about. Now, I think that the campaign will continue because I think that there are broader issues here generally about access to Lords, and also obviously it's very important that the universities are held to this promise that they've made, because it does still strike me as a little bit vague that they've just said, oh well, we'll sort it out in a few months' time, we'll decide what the exact format is going to be and what the women will get to play and what the men will get to play at some future point that hasn't been defined. So that's a little bit of a concern, but overall really positive, and just congratulations to Vanessa and Roisin, who have been running the campaign and who have achieved something really important and really kind of, you might think, oh, it's only varsity, it doesn't matter if you didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge or whatever, but I think there's something symbolically important about making sure that women in whatever context are given equal opportunities to their male peers. So congratulations.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much for watching this week. We'll be back here next week. In the meantime, we may or may not be able to watch some cricket after having last week washed out as well. We were really looking forward to today, but if it can't be, it can't be. We'll see. We'll see you here back for another vodcast in a week's time. Anyway, all the best. Bye bye.